Sci-Fi is the best fi, so I thought I'd look my best in order to bring you the best sci-fi I read in 2022. Starting with number 10, Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill. Sea of Rust is a book that I was excited to read because of 1, the stunning cover art, and 2, because this is a book about robots. I love a story about robots, androids, cyborgs, and this book is set in a post-apocalyptic setting, and sometimes dystopian post-apocalyptic books can be a little slow, a little depressing, but this was a really fun, fast-paced, action-packed adventure. It's not what I expected, but this book was thoroughly entertaining and really surprised me in a really, really good way. The author of this book is also a screenwriter, most well known for Doctor Strange, and that definitely comes through in this book because the pacing is phenomenal and each chapter kind of feels like a scene. There's a clear point, a clear hook, and there's always something that he drops at the end of each chapter that hooks you in, makes you want to keep on reading, keep turning those pages. Something else that impressed me about Sea of Rust was that in the book we follow 2 separate timelines, and I enjoyed both of them pretty equally. Often when I'm reading a book that bounces back and forth between narratives, I tend to develop a favorite and start to wish when we're in another one that we were back with the one that I enjoy the most, but both of these timelines, these storylines, I found to be very engaging. I think this book should have a pretty broad appeal because it has some interesting characters, some funny dialogue, and a fast-paced story. I think this would be a great book to recommend to readers that are newer to the genre of sci-fi, but I think it also should have some appeal to some more experienced, some long-time readers of science fiction, because there's some pretty cool concepts in there as well to do with artificial intelligence in particular. I don't have any major complaints about the book. I perhaps hoped the ending was going to be a little bit more ambitious, as it did touch on some themes to do with technology and consciousness that I really enjoyed and think it could have pushed just a little bit further. But overall, this was a thoroughly enjoyable read and my 10th favorite sci-fi book I read in 2022. At number 9, we have A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick. So I read 2 more books by Philip K. Dick in 2022, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and A Scanner Darkly. And while Ubik is still my favorite PKD book overall, I very much enjoyed those 2, and I picked A Scanner Darkly for this list because of the emotional impact this book had on me. So A Scanner Darkly is set in the near future of the 1990s, where a large portion of society is addicted to something called Substance D. And this book explores some really interesting themes to do with addiction and identity. And I think Philip K. Dick masterfully wrote this book to convey a very particular atmosphere and tone. This book gave me a real feeling of paranoia and anxiety and confusion over what was real and surreal. I think he had a particular vision in mind and absolutely executed on that vision. This book starts out with some very funny dialogue, but as reality started to set in for me as the reader, the book kind of progressed from something that was rather comedic to something that was very hard-hitting emotionally. Towards the end of the book, the story started to go in a direction that somewhat lost my interest, but when we got to the very end and Philip K. Dick revealed what that was all building towards, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And then that was followed by an afterword from the author himself that kind of put the story into context within his own life, and that just added to the emotional impact and weight of the story. One of my favorite reads of the year, A Scanner Darkly at number 9. Moving on to number 8, we have Deathstalker by Simon R. Green. So Deathstalker was a great find for me in 2022. I decided to pick it up after my friend Ilan gave me the great pitch of, if Hyperion is fine dining, then Deathstalker is a greasy bucket of fried chicken, which I think is the perfect description of Deathstalker because it is trashy, pulpy, sci-fantasy, sword and planet space opera that is just pure fun goodness. Simon R. Green really threw the kitchen sink at this book in terms of the sci-fi concepts, and there's lots of great action, it's a little bit gory, there's some really fun characters. Just to give you a sense of the tone of this book, some of the main characters are named Owen Deathstalker and Valentine Wolf. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, it's really fun, it's over the top. I don't think this book is going to appeal to everyone, but if this sounds like your sense of humor, your sense of style, I think you're really going to like it. I've convinced about 4 or 5 people to pick this book up so far, and all of them have come back to me and said they really, really enjoyed it. So I hope you try out Deathstalker. I think it's a little bit under the radar, but I think if you do, you'll have a fun time with it. Next, at number 7, we have Ilium by Dan Simmons. So Ilium is part of the Ilium and Olympus duology by Dan Simmons, and I think it's one of the most ambitious things I've ever read. It takes the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, and then combines that with other historical and literary references such as Proust and Shakespeare, and then sets that story on the planet of Mars and combines that with hard physics, hard quantum mechanics, and a crazy sci-fi space opera story. It's an absolutely wild ride that I think hit some incredible highs despite being a little bit flawed as well. So it took me a little while to get into this book, and I don't think the character writing is quite as strong as it was from Simmons in the Hyperion Cantos, but there were a few characters that I connected with, and once we really started to dive into the sci-fi concepts, once the story really got rolling, I thought this was a really fun roller coaster of a journey. I think it built to something pretty epic by the end. I was definitely cheering and hyped to see what would come in the sequel, Olympos. I did read the sequel, Olympos, and I felt like it really delivered on some of the concepts and narrative threads, but some of the scenes made for some rather uncomfortable reading, and I felt like the very end was just a little bit anticlimactic. So for that reason, Ilium was the one that I preferred of the two, the book that made the list. And if you're someone that enjoys some historical fiction and fantasy as well as sci-fi, and a book that really kind of swings for the fences, then you might also enjoy Ilium by Dan Simmons. With my sixth favorite read of the year, we have Aversion by Alistair Reynolds. Aversion is a unique read because it starts on a sailing ship in the 1800s, and it doesn't feel very sci-fi at all. But then our main character starts to experience similar expeditions on different timelines, in different time periods, and it creates this great mystery of what exactly is happening, how these different things are connected, and what can be done to stop these disasters from happening over and over again. I think this book might start to lose some people around the middle, but I think if you just keep going, you'll be rewarded with some mind-boggling ideas, as well as, in my opinion, some of Reynolds' best character work. I've read 3 books from him now. I really enjoyed Chasm City. This book is on this list, and House of Suns is one of my all-time favorites. So I'm excited to read more from Reynolds. Revelation Space is on my TBR for 2023, so I'm excited to read that. And Aversion, I think a good place to start with Reynolds if you haven't read him before. It's short, it's weird, it'll blow your mind. So just quickly, before we get to the top 5, if you enjoy discussing sci-fi, then feel free to join us on Discord and on Patreon. They are black tie only, but dress up and we can talk some sci-fi. Making it into our top 5, at number 5, we have Ashes of Man by Christopher Rocchio. Many of you know that I'm a massive fan of the Sun Eater series, and I was actually lucky enough recently to have Christopher Rocchio on the channel with me to discuss some sci-fi books for fantasy readers. And I think things that people will love about the Sun Eater series is that it has wonderfully layered characters, epic world building, some really cool sci-fi concepts, and some of the best action and fight scenes that I've ever read. And then you add on top of that Christopher Rocchio is just an absolutely beautiful writer. So I read 2 Sun Eater books in 2022, Kingdoms of Death and Ashes of Man. I really enjoyed both of them, but I think I just slightly preferred the style of Ashes of Man. Each Sun Eater book kind of has its own unique feel, and I really connected with Ashes of Man. I think that overall, Demon in White is still my number 1 pick for the Sun Eater series, just because that's the biggest book, it's the one with the most epic moments, but the last 2 books delivered some real emotional punches, and I can't wait to see what crazy things Rocchio has store for us with the ending of this series. Next, at number 4, we have Waystation by Clifford D. Simak. Waystation, in my opinion, is a deserved classic. It follows a Civil War veteran that lives a reclusive life on a farm and also takes care of an intergalactic way station. Waystation isn't so much driven by the plot so much as it is by the exploration of themes such as war and technology and relationships, and I think that Simak explored these topics in an incredibly impactful way. Simak also has a beautiful writing style that really evokes a particular sense of time and place. Even just thinking about the book now, I'm reminded of emotions that the book was able to evoke in me while reading them, and I think he just has such a wonderful writing style that reminds me a little bit of John Wyndham, and while he's less absurd and comedic, I think there were also some touches of Kurt Vonnegut in there that I sensed as well. So I think this is a classic that while it is a classic, I think perhaps not enough people have read. So hopefully that sounds interesting to you, and I hope more people check out Waystation. At number 3 on my list, we have The Dark Forest by Cixin Liu. I read the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy in 2022, and it instantly became one of my favorite sci-fi series of all time. Yes, the character writing can be a little bit dry, they're a little bit cold, and some of the science went over my head, but the ideas in this book are just absolutely mind-boggling. Going through some of the concepts in this series will really just melt your mind. It'll make your brain bleed in the absolute best kind of way. If you read the first book, The Three-Body Problem, and hate it, that's okay. The series just might not be for you. But if you read the first book and think it's just okay, then I would recommend pushing on, because I thought that books 2 and 3 took the series, the concepts, to absolute new levels. It was really hard for me to choose which of the two to put on this list, because I absolutely loved The Dark Forest and Death's End. I think the concepts in Death's End are even crazier. I think that pushes the limits of my brain even further than the rest of the books in the series, but I went with The Dark Forest because I thought it was the book with the best plot progression. There were so many cool story ideas in The Dark Forest that I felt like could have been their own book, and yet Cixin Liu packed around 6, 7, or 8 of them into The Dark Forest alone. He would set up these really interesting ideas and then either resolve them or take it in a completely unexpected direction, and it just kept the pages turning for me. This was the one that I read the fastest, so that's why The Dark Forest I put on my list for my number 3 read of the year. At number 2 we have Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I loved The Martian, and I found Project Hail Mary to be an absolutely delightful read as well. I think it shares enough similarities to The Martian that if you enjoyed that book, there's a pretty high chance you're going to enjoy Project Hail Mary as well, but it does a few things differently that I think it doesn't feel repetitive and perhaps in some ways takes the book to even higher heights. I felt like I preferred the setting in The Martian, but 2 things that I really enjoyed from Project Hail Mary was, number 1, the scale and scope of the ideas. The sci-fi concepts that Andy Weir packs into Project Hail Mary, I found to be absolutely phenomenal. I was totally engrossed, and the way he kind of makes these crazy ideas accessible, delivers them to you in a fast-paced way, I found to be such a fun way to spend my time smashing my way through Project Hail Mary. And number 2, the second thing that I really enjoyed was the characters and the relationships. So I won't go into the specifics for spoiler reasons, but I felt like Project Hail Mary hit emotional heights that were even higher than The Martian for me. Something else that's great about Project Hail Mary is that I can recommend this to pretty much any reader. So my dad, who reads only a little bit of sci-fi, absolutely loved Project Hail Mary. Some of my booktube friends that read more fantasy than sci-fi, like Dominish Books and Jake Bishop, also had a fantastic time with Project Hail Mary. And myself, someone that pretty much only reads sci-fi, also absolutely loved Project Hail Mary. So this was my second favorite read of 2022. I hope you love it too. And finally, my favorite sci-fi read of 2022. At number 1, the award goes to Permutation City by Greg Egan. Permutation City is a hard sci-fi virtual reality cyberpunk novel in which immortality exists for those who can afford it. Permutation City hits on a few familiar sci-fi tropes, but then pushes the sci-fi concepts so much further than anything I've ever read before. This book really messed with my understanding of physics and the universe itself. I can't think of a time where I finished a book and then ended up spending so much time researching the ideas afterwards. I'm more of a science fiction than science person myself, but I absolutely love the science, the concepts, the ideas, and I read so many articles after this book because it just kind of created some existential questions, crises if you will, in my mind afterwards. And while some of the physics and biochemistry went a little bit over my head, reading this book isn't just an academic exercise. It's a really fun story as well. There are so many moments, so many reveals or twists in this book that I thought were just absolutely jaw-dropping reading experiences. I can't think of many books that for me had as many 10 out of 10 individual get hyped, this is why I read sci-fi moments as I had in Permutation City. If you can tolerate even just a little bit of hard sci-fi, please give Permutation City a chance. It was my favorite read of 2022 and one of my all-time favorite books. So there you go guys, that was my top 10 I'll put some honorable mentions in the comments, and I'd love to hear from you guys what were some of your favorite reads of 2022. Thank you to all of you that watched any of my videos over the past year, including my patrons, in particular my cyborgs, Nima and A New Eden. I hope you had a great reading year, and I look forward to more amazing sci-fi in 2023. Until then, subscribe, it's free, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.